So that is a very short excerpt from one of the combat pieces I wrote for a game called Moss. The game came out a couple of months ago, I think, and the soundtrack is coming out very, very, very soon. I thought this would be a great way to demonstrate how I like to use reverb. And I'm kind of splitting it into two different camps. There's like a soloist kind of camp, and then there's an ensemble kind of camp. And this is for orchestra stuff. I'm also going to cover reverb for drums or percussion or something like that. But I thought we'd start with soloists. So here is Kristin. I will give you her links in the description because she is my absolute favorite woodwind player. Don't be embarrassed, Kristin. You know that you're really, really, really good. If anyone needs her for woodwinds, her information will be at the bottom. On this particular game, she played flute, oboe, English horn, and clarinet. And I immediately started another game, and she's playing bass flute and alto flute, or maybe it's just alto flute. I can't quite remember, but I digress. So here's Kristin, and what I'm going to do is just play her part. Well, I'll let you look. There's not a lot going on in this one section. This is kind of at the end of the song, and there's some pizzicato strings down at the bottom, and some live tracks here, and this is her track. So I'm staying quiet at the end so you can hear that reverb tail. Now the tail is a combination of her track, there's reverb, individual independent reverbs on all of these two live tracks. This is a sample track of clock sounds I got from the developer of the game, and I put them into a contact instrument and was playing them back as little mechanical noises. Plus the strings down here, which mostly I think have already been committed to stems because this is the final version of the piece. That's why you see a lot of things are white. I've got all my effects stacked up, and basically this was the last step before I exported all the stems. So with soloists, I want to be able to have control over whether they sound like they're up at the front of the stage or if they're further back in the stage. And for Moss, it was a little bit of a back and forth mentally in my head because this is actually one of the few pieces that has a full orchestra. The combat pieces are the only ones really that have kind of brass and a full string ensemble. Most of the pieces are all soloists. So Kristin and Jeff Ball, I'll put his link down at the bottom as well, played violin for me. And then I played all kinds of plucky, strummy kinds of things. And it was kind of like a pub band sort of feel. So I was trying to figure out the best way to get the soloists when there's orchestra playing to sit in the mix, because they needed to sound like they were part of the orchestra, but I also wanted them to sound like a featured soloist. So the big thing that I use when I'm using soloists, when it's a completely dry setup, is this Ocean Way Studio plugin. But why don't we look at the whole signal chain first so I can mute this stuff as we go through, and then we'll listen to it and I'll add it back on slowly. So she's got a little EQ and a compressor and Ocean Way Studios, which is essentially, it would help if I actually put it on the screen. EQ, compression, Ocean Way Studios. This is basically an early reflection. It's like what I use as an early reflection tool, and this dry wet is controlling how much of the room sound from Ocean Way I want to have. Now from there, there's nothing else listed. And it's going to Oboe++, which is my secondary bus. So if I go there to my secondary bus and find the oboe, a little bit of a console thing, and then there's 3 reverb sends here. I'm going to turn these off at the moment, and we'll talk about those in a second. Then from the reverb sends, it goes to one more channel that's got probably a little more right here, a couple of other things on it. But the main point of this is to turn that reverb off and turn this reverb off. So here we are. Nice and dry, great signal, great tone, great reverb, great vibrato. The reverb's pretty great as well, but the timbre and vibrato, I really love her stuff. So the first thing I did was put this Ocean Way plugin in here. And it looks like it's just on the close mic, and it's a little less than 50%. And the great thing about this plugin, first of all, it's UAD. I'm a huge fan of UAD. Number one, everything they do sounds amazing. Number two, it's all processed with their own independent processors. So I've got 3 of those 8-core cards slotted into the back of my main machine, and I can run, actually I think Moss was probably one of the biggest things that I used a lot of UAD on and a lot of different reverbs. And the reverbs are some of the most process-intensive plugins, and even now I'm at 66% of the maximum kind of load on the UAD processors, and there's something ridiculous like 40 or 50 reverbs, maybe even 60, plus a bunch of other effects and things. And it's nice because even if I want to put the Cubase in this mode, which turns all the plugins off and takes the processing load off the CPU, if I want to say record something live and hear no delay in my headphones as I'm performing, that doesn't include any of the UAD. All the UAD stuff stays on, which is just fantastic. So I'm going to play the beginning without this reverb. Actually, I'm going to pull this down and turn this on, which means all we're getting is a dry signal. And as I move this up, you'll be able to hear more and more of the room. Now that's just the close mic, and you can adjust the distance and the microphone choice. These are all impulse responses, and you can choose, there's different presets, and there's all kinds of great demos and information on UAD's website about that. I was just using the close mic, and I think I'll pull it back down to where I had it. So I apologize for the clicks, but sometimes it's really nice just to be able to hear the difference between the two. And it's, I won't say subtle, it's not subtle, but it puts her in a room. It puts her in a very nice room. And it gives that little bit of early reflection that lets you hear the distance from her oboe to the microphone. And basically, the more wet this signal is, the more you're hearing the distance. And for whatever reason, that's where I like to have it. After that, it's going here out of this bus, and that's where we get to the reverbs. Well, Ocean Way is a reverb, yes, but I consider it more of a placing an early reflection sort of effect. It's not a reverb. When I think of reverb, I think of the tail, and it's just a technical thing, but let's go back to here. So this signal we just saw is coming in here, and I've just got a little bit of EQ or something on there. And I'll do something from Moss and go through more track explanation and plugins and things like that. This is solely focusing on reverb. So I've got a short, medium, and long, and those are literally the lengths of the reverbs. There's a short reverb, a medium reverb, and a long reverb. And however these are set up, see, this is English horn solo, a little bit less of a send there and on the short, but there's more for the oboe. So instead of having one reverb and trying to dial in the early reflections and then focus the mid-range and put an EQ within the plugin and pull the top down with a shelf and do all that sort of stuff. I kind of went short, medium, long, and I treated each individual reverb send with maybe a little EQ or compression or something like that. And I had a lot more control over the sound. And really that's what it comes down to, is how much I can control it. So I not only have control over what the EQ and return sounds like from each one of these reverbs, but I also have individual control over the send to all three of them, which is why you see some different levels of send here. Like the violin, the medium, I did not need as much. And that might seem like -12 and -16 isn't that much of a difference, but when you're listening to it in context, you really can tell a difference. So these reverbs exist on my effects mix, and here they are. And I think what I'm going to have to do is unsolo and solo this back now that I've turned the sends back on. And see now the sends going to the reverbs, and the reverbs themselves are soloed, so we can hear everything. Now it looks like I have the same, so I've got solo flute, solo oboe, solo English horn, and solo violin. And those are the kind of 4 key soloists that I used in the score. And I don't remember going through and choosing these reverbs, but obviously I chose them for a reason. All UAD again. The plate plugins are just really nice. And this is a very short decay time. And if I pull up the medium, I have a feeling it will probably be longer. That one's maxed out. It looks like it's the same reverb, it's just one's short and one's long. And then on the second one, let's see if we can get these kind of in order. So on the second one, I'm rolling off some lows in the middle and then more lows on the sides and a little bit of multiband compression, which I imagine isn't doing extreme things, but it's all about a little bit goes a long way. It's the same reason I like having things spread out across multiple channels in my template itself. So I'm not focusing on, you know, this one synth sound and I stuck 7 plugins on there because I'm trying to get a certain effect or something, and then trying to remember which one goes which way and how they're all lined up, and oh, that's right, that one doesn't have a mix knob on it, so I need to... This way, it's kind of staged, and I stage it the same way every time. So when I'm in a particular project like Moss, I know that I've got those 3 sets of reverbs for those 4 solo instruments, and I can pull them up right here next to each other and compare them. They're not spread out across multiple channels or across multiple mixing board configurations. Everything's really easy to get a hold of. Did we turn them on yet? We did. All right. So let's turn these off. Here's our short reverb. And you can hear it's just a very nice short reverb. Here's the medium reverb. I'm curious to see what this does too. Well, I know what that one does. I'm curious to see how much dancing we get here. I'm imagining it's subtle. I remember now, after looking at this is here purely as a safety measure. That kind of 800 to 900 hertz gets a little honky in the Verb, and if it got a little loud, I had the threshold set so it would just pull it back a little bit, and same thing with the low end. It wasn't necessarily doing anything all the time, it was just there as a safety guard. And this is the longest reverb. That one's nice and long. And it's one of those things that I suppose technically you could use one reverb to do all this, but I just like the idea of having control over them, having control of the sends, having control of the EQ coming back from them, and especially unless you're talking about like a Bricasti reverb, for example, which the UAD cards are 8-core cards. Well, a Bricasti reverb has 8 processors in it, and it's just doing a single stereo reverb. So you imagine that the algorithms and the calculations of having one UAD 8-core card that can only do a single reverb, you could probably do something like 30 or 40 reverbs on a UAD card. And that doesn't mean that their reverbs are bad, they're amazing. But that's why the Bricastis are expensive, because it's literally an 8-core processor inside just doing a single stereo reverb. That's really the only reverb that I don't mind just doing a send and tweaking a little bit and leaving it alone. And I don't feel the need to stack up multiple verbs because it just sounds so amazing. These sound amazing as well, but I feel like I get a smoother kind of sound, and it doesn't sound like, oh, that's a plate, or oh, that's the Lexicon. They kind of homogenize in a good way and create this fuller sort of sound. See, I need to put pictures on my mixing board so that for the effects sends, because with these guys here, I always end up getting them confused, and the pictures just help so much. So I'm going to start. I'll just play it twice, and I'll add the reverbs as we go. And now I'm going to put the icing, the last one. And this third one's really all about that really long tail. So the idea is, that's how I process a soloist. And I imagine if she were playing longer, more legato lines, I would probably have a little more reverb, meaning on the sends themselves. Here, I would turn it up. And if it's faster like this combat piece, I would have it pulled back a little bit. And it's all automatable, and I know where it is. It's all right here. I don't need to pull up an extra drop-down menu and do all this crazy stuff. Having everything broken out, basically, there's more to deal with, but there's also a lot more control, which I think goes a long way. Now that we've covered soloists and how I like to use reverb kind of individually with specific soloists, let's focus on the Cubase template and how I have reverb in that. And yes, I'm wearing a different shirt because now it's a different day. By the way, thanks for hanging in with me, because a lot of this is really just a matter of me squeezing time in between deadlines to like pontificate at the camera. And I do plan things a little bit so that I'm not hemming and hawing the whole entire time, but most of it, 99% of it, is just off the top of my head. I really appreciate all the support that you guys have given so far. It does mean a lot, and it inspires me to do more stuff, because I just love sharing, and I hope there are people out there that love learning as much as I do. Okay, so on to reverb in Cubase. Probably the easiest thing to do is to show you this little setup right here. And if you're watching this because you want to know about reverb in general and you haven't watched any of the previous VE Pro or Cubase template videos, I encourage you to go back and take a look. I talk about a lot of stuff that I'm going to just kind of gloss over here. This is sort of the signal flow of my busing structure. So the orchestra, the drums, the synths, and the loops all come back, and they all go into this bus. And then I've got effects, another bus, and another bus. Now the reason I'm showing you this is any one of these 5 first kind of stages can have effects sends. Now most of my effects in my template are reverb, and there's a couple of other things, but mostly it's reverb. So any of these can have reverb sends. And the reason I have my reverb positioned here is because no matter where I'm assigning them, if it's an orchestra return from VST, from VE Pro, too many acronyms. If it's an orchestra return from VE Pro, like on horns, which is an example I'm going to give, the send is here. I'm using this signal from my horns to send to the effects way down here. But all of the effects, and I can change it if I want, but most of the time, all of my effects are going out and coming in to this bus. That's why I have my kind of effects mixing board, or what's the technical term that they use? Configuration. So my effects configuration is here because almost all the time it's coming into here. So let's go take a look at the effects, and I'll make this window a little bit bigger for you. Now at the front end of all the effects is going to be just a generic setup all the way down to here, where it says string effects. So this is general, either a long orchestra sound. If I point to it, it makes the name disappear. Either a long orchestra sound or a short orchestra sound. And then broken up by either these are high woodwinds, these are low woodwinds. And then these are ensemble woodwinds, which usually, whether you're talking about winds or strings, the ensemble basically means it's an ensemble patch, like something in Albion that has the whole register of woodwinds across the keyboard, or the entire register of strings across the keyboard, or it's an actual ensemble patch like from Cinematic Studio Strings, for example. They've got all the articulations as an ensemble patch as well. And the only reason I have it split out separately is I never know what I'm going to do with those ensemble patches. Sometimes I want them to stand on their own because I just like the way the ensemble patch sounds. Most of the time I'm using ensemble patches to reinforce something that maybe isn't as strong as I would like it to be in the regular patches. For example, low strings. Let's say that I'm doing like a Bartok Pitts, or a Collegno would be a great example. So I'm doing Collegno on the low strings and I want to boost them a little bit. I'm going to go to the ensemble patch and I can turn it up a little bit more. And then I know that the ensemble patch for that particular file is boosting Collegno strings on the low end, meaning the low strings, and I will route that ensemble patch accordingly. Because what all of this kind of complicated structure and bussing has to do with is stems. I want to be able to, at the end of the day, pull up my list, choose audio export, and just tick the boxes of the stems that I want. And I know when I choose low strings that, for example, that ensemble patch that I use the Collegno for to boost in the low strings is bussing and going the correct place. Which is why, with a lot of these, when we move down here, you see there's no output assigned yet. There's one assigned here because that's an example that I'm going to show. Everything else, there's no output because I haven't used it yet. And down here, those are Bricastis. That's another story. There's my affix. This is the only thing that is not reverb, these three affix guys. And then these are assigned because this is assigned all the time. We're going to go over affix and drums and how it's a match made in heaven very soon. And the ProR is a demonstration I'm using for the drums as well. So that's only assigned because I've got it preset for the example that we're talking about today. Everything else, it's just a matter of having the channels here and being able to choose it. And I've got a couple of presets already set up. Choose it and then route it where I want it to go, depending on what my source is and where I want the ultimate stem to bounce. So why do I have long and short for high woodwinds and long and short for low woodwinds? Well, that all comes back to the stems, because in my stems I will have a long woodwind high and a short woodwind high. And that's normally because the longs are going to be playing either pads or little swells or a melody of sort. The shorts are going to be playing accents and more kind of action, staccato-y sort of things. The reason I have them on separate reverbs is mostly because I want to be able to have the longs and shorts separated in stems, but also partially I will probably have less reverb on the shorts than I do on the longs. Now I'm probably gonna make myself a liar here and pull these up, but let's see what the presets are. Oh, hey, I actually know what I'm talking about a little bit. So this is the long woodwind, and it's got 2.6 seconds. And it's just the large haul from the Lexicon 224 UAD. This is the short woodwind. And as you can see, it looks to me like everything is exactly the same. I pulled the mid-time down a little bit, and I pulled the bass down a little bit, which is basically the overall tail of the reverb. Pre-delay's pulled down to nothing on both of them, and it's really just a matter of the shorts being sharper and shorter, and I was sort of losing the emphasis of the shorts when the tail was longer, especially if it was a faster passage, it was kind of building up a wash. So I pulled a good second off the tail. So it's a second shorter, and it's adding kind of more ambience than it is a bloom of a hall or something like that. Now, traditionally, that's not the way it works in a recording setup. If you're listening to a classical orchestra on stage, there's going to be a lot of reverb everywhere, and everything kind of gets homogenized in a good way because it's a live ensemble. When you're talking about film scoring setups, those stages are actually a lot drier. And even Abbey Road Studio One, which for me, Abbey Road and Air and Sony in LA are kind of the best of the best. But they only have, once you're recording, the microphones are picking up a second or two of reverb. And really it's more about the early reflections and picking up the room in the mics with the instruments at the same time. As far as a tail is concerned, I did do Sony, but I'm not sure what they use for reverb in Sony, but I've been to Abbey Road a lot, Studio One and Studio Two, and they have Bricastis in there that they use that are set up to about a 2.2 or 2.3 second tail. And they will literally blend that in and record it as a separate channel in Pro Tools, but blend it in when you're monitoring the orchestra live to give you that sort of big tail that you hear in film scores. So what was my point about long versus short? It kind of depends on what kind of music you're writing and how you want to treat it. And as with everything else I've been talking about, these are my starting points. This is the reason for having a template. I have some place to start, and then I tweak it with each piece as needed. So the same thing applies for the low woodwinds, long and short, the low brass, long and short, the horns, the trumpets. The long and short is split up the same way between all of them. So if I expand these effects channels, it's extremely wide, but you can see where we're going here. Woodwinds high long is going to the plus plus woodwinds high long, and plus plus designates the interstellar configuration. So these effects are going straight from here to here. You can see how everything pretty much lines up consistently across the board. All the way down, strings, and then here we start getting to soloists. String ensemble high and short, everything from these first groups of effects at least are coming from the orchestra returns, going to here, and then the effects themselves are going to here. Now something very important worth mentioning, if you are trying to do something like this, this isn't the most straightforward because they modeled this after the original 224 remote that sits on top of mixing consoles. But you want to make sure if you're using a send that's running parallel to your channel. What this means is there are two ways you can put effects in any DAW. One of them is to put it like serial or in series. And when you're putting an EQ on a drum loop, let's say, the standard way you do it is just you're adding an EQ to the drum loop channel. That's in series, or a serial effect, meaning that it's just the signal is running 100% through the EQ and then down into whatever other plugins you want to add. And I would say probably most people, especially if you're talking about kind of pop or dance music production, they're using things that way. And EQs and things like that are always run that way because you want the signal to be 100% processed. With reverb and delays, a lot of times you can use those as a parallel effect, meaning that you're running it as a send. And the reason it's called parallel is you've got your first signal. I don't know, for some reason for me, signals go from top to down, I guess from up to bottom. So it runs top to bottom in my head. And I think that's because that's the way you put plugins in a DAW. And that's also the way, if you're looking at a mixing board, you've got your effect sends, the effect send 1 and 2 and 3. It's all top to bottom, the same way you read left to right. So if you're running it parallel, if you're using it as a send, your normal channel is going this way. And I'm going to do it from my perspective. Then you've got a send, and you're sending that exact same channel parallel to the first one. The only difference is the parallel channel has some sort of an effect on it. It's a reverb, or it's a delay, or it could even be some sort of a chorus or exciter or something like that. So they're actually two copies of your signal running at the same time. It's just one has an effect and one is dry. And you could also run compression. We'll talk about parallel compression in another episode. So if you're running a standard effect, a serial or series effect, just the normal way, it's automatically at 100% wet. So if you're putting a reverb on there, you're probably controlling the mix balance. It either says dry wet or mix or something like that. Here on the Lexicon, it says dry wet, but it also has a solo button, which means 100%. And if I tap this, it just went to 50%, and I can control it this way. Now it's at 72%, or you just mash the button and it's automatically at 100% wet. So when you're dealing with inline, serial, or series effects, when you're just putting it on your sound, you're putting it on your channel, you want to adjust the reverb balance. Like I did on the soloists, a dry versus wet. You can control how much reverb is on there because it's the only reverb going to that one channel. That channel is controlling the reverb and no other channels can access it because you have it just on that one. And when we're talking about parallel with a send, you can put as many channels through that reverb as you want. And that's the way it works with this Lexicon effect that we're looking at. Anything that I want this to go to, I can send any signal to brass ensemble short, and it's going to go to this. You can share an effect. And this actually works really, really well if you're talking about saving on processor load, for example. Maybe you want all of your string sounds to go to a same singular reverb. Maybe you want your whole orchestra to go to a series of similar reverbs because you don't need to worry about stems. You're just doing stereo. You could send everything to like an early reflection reverb and then also send it to maybe a midpoint reverb that's got a little bit of a maybe 1 second hall on it, and then also send everything to a tail late reflection reverb that's got a 2 second tail on it. And then you have independent control of those three reverbs. You adjust the reverbs and you're controlling the reverb to the entire orchestra because all of those VSTs are sharing the same reverb. So that's the power and the difference between running something parallel versus running something serial. And parallel is the one with the send on it. I feel like I should have a quiz after this or something, but we'll do gold stars for quizzes later on, maybe. So I can't stress the importance. If you're using a send like this, which means you're running it parallel, you have to have your mix, whatever plugin it is, the internal mix of the plugin needs to be set to 100% wet. And I've got that for all of my effects. They're all set to solo or 100% wet. That pretty much covers the orchestra side of things. Here's a good example of why it's great to be able to use and share reverbs. All my low strings are going to this reverb bus, but you see I have it panned to the right on short and long, and that's to help with the balance panning wise of the strings. So if I'm, let's see, how do we do this? The camera's always backwards. If I'm sitting in a concert hall, the basses are going to be on the right on stage, and I'm in the audience. Now, what reverb is great about doing is gelling and homogenizing everything, but I've found, especially with the reverbs that I'm using, they also tend to pull everything towards the middle a little bit. And I'm not a huge fan of having basses hard right in the soundscape if you're, sitting and listening to a set of speakers, but anytime I've done anything live, they're always a little bit off to the right. And 1 or 2 times I've centered them because it's an electronic score as well, and I want the bass for the orchestra and the bass for the hybrid stuff to sort of line up panning-wise. But just from a mix perspective, thinking of the instruments on the stage, the reverb I had was pulling the basses a little more towards the center, and it was actually, you were getting kind of a funky, it sounded like they were playing in the right, and then you were hearing the sound move because the reverb was kind of tailing in after the initial sound of the basses. So that's why I've got it panned over here to the right. And we've talked about Ocean Way and how much I love that for early reflections. This is actually just presets I have here, and these are just examples of what I use them for, really, more than anything else. And my percussion presets 1 through 6, usually they'll just be named Jason, because it's when I'm recording stuff here, and I've got the Lexicon set up and deactivated right now because it's really something super specific. These are my Lexicon versions of imitating the Bricastis, which we'll do a A-B comparison with in a moment. And then everything else is just superfluous, fun reverbs that I've used in the past and I really like, and they're sitting here ready to go. I already have the preset tweaked and I have the channel named after what it is. And then I've got these affects, which are aural exciters. We'll talk about that in a minute when I get to drums. And then my Bricastis. Now the Bricastis are the only 3 external effects that I'm using. And boy, is it ever worth using it as an external effect. And the beauty about Cubase is you can use an external effect as a plugin. So basically this is a plugin that is linking a send, return, and a compensated delay to and from the hardware unit. And you just click this button. Look, isn't that just great? So it'll automatically do the delay compensation. It doesn't quite work for reverb because a lot of times you have pre-delay on reverb, meaning that you've got 20 to 60, sometimes even 80 milliseconds of a delay that the reverb waits to kick the reverb out. So it processes the dry signal and then it's going to wait 20 to 80 milliseconds, which is the kind of standard thing when you're talking about orchestra stuff, for the reverb. And by delaying the reverb, it's making the sound appear closer because you're getting that 20 to 80 milliseconds of dry sound before the reverb comes in. That's what pre-delay means. So for example, you would have pre-delay on something. The more you turn up the pre-delay, that's the delay that the reverb is waiting to come in, and it gives you a sense of closeness. It gives you a sense of closeness. Pre-delay equals closeness. So since there's a built-in pre-delay to some of these reverb presets, if you do delay compensation, if there's an 80 millisecond pre-delay, it's going to have 80 milliseconds plus whatever the pre-delay, the compensation is for the reverb itself on the plugin. I know that it's about 20 milliseconds for my hardware to spit out and get fed back in. So I have my Bricastis basically defaulting to that. And the affects are the same way, and we'll pull them up when we get to drums. So that's more or less how the reverbs are routed. And I thought that I could just do an example here of what they sound like and how I use them. Let me turn this off. So these are my horns from my own library, and I'm using this library because they're completely dry. And I can give you a really good comparison of how the reverbs work and the benefits of having them on a send as a parallel effect. So this is just something I did really quick. So I'm going to play this dry first for you so you can hear it without any reverb whatsoever. And then we'll really be able to tell the differences between the reverbs when we audition a few. I told you it was dry as a bone. Now what I default to is the Bricasti for my brass. And the reason will become evident soon enough. So here's where our horns are coming in. They come in back here at the orchestra return, and I have them bust to the first plus interplanetary. This is the very beginning of the return. So I've got IO is my orchestra samples. So horns 1, 2, and 3, those are the 3 MIDI channels that you just saw. They've got their own stereo returns from VE Pro. And usually I just have the Bricasti turned on. You can hear there's a really nice tail there. It's a really big full sounding hall. And literally all it is, this is a plugin that allows you to control the Bricasti just like if it were software, which is super cool. It's literally on the first hall that pops up in the menu, large hall. It's 2.15 seconds. I think I tweaked a couple of things here. This is all the stuff that you can kind of control within the Bricasti reverb itself, and this plugin just gives you access to all of it. And what's great about the plugin is it's MIDI recallable, it's automatable. You can change things, do anything you want. But as you see, since I'm using it as a parallel effect, as a send effect, I have it on 100% wet. Nothing dry is coming through here. And everything else gets a lot more technical. I've got it through digital ins and outs within my system. That's a whole other outboard processing kind of thing, which I promise we will do eventually. So that's what the Bricasti sounds like. Now my horns are very, very dry, so if I wanted to push them a little further back in the mix, that's 100% dry horns and 100% Bricasti reverb, because this is set to 0, which basically means 100%. If I wanted to make the horns sound like they were further back, all I'd have to do, and I think most of my reverbs are defaulted to this pre-fader position. And I've talked about pre and post fader a little bit before, and I'm probably going to do a quick tip on it as well. But the idea is any normal send that you use defaults to post fader. And all that means is the amount of signal you're sending out to the reverb or whatever effect you're sending to is controlled by this fader. So if you have this pulled way down, there's a little tiny bit of signal going to the reverb. And if you have it pulled down to nothing, you don't hear any reverb at all. It's post fader, meaning it's going out after this fader. If you switch it to pre-fader, and this is a very common thing you can do on any DAW, now the reverb is being sent by this fader. And this fader is going to have no control over what amount of signal is going to the reverb. Now what's nice about that is you can leave this at 100%, and this is now your dry, wet mix knob. So if I'm listening at 100% reverb, if I pull this, let's grab all of them. If I pull them down, let's just say 6 dB. Now I've just reduced the dry signal by 6 dB, but the wet signal is still at 100%. And if we pull it down all the way, you're only hearing the Bricasti return. There's no dry signal going at all. So I think you can hear the reason that Bricasti reverbs are spoken so highly of. They're spoken about. You can hear why they sound so good. They're an amazing, amazing sounding reverb, but it comes at a cost. It's a financial cost because they're expensive. They're expensive because they have 8 processors in them, and you've got a single rack unit that literally does a single stereo reverb. But it sounds amazing because all that processing power is back there. They're also expensive in the sense that you only get 1 reverb per unit, so if you want to use them and use more than 1 reverb at a time, you have to have more units. And it's just a matter of choosing what works best for you. I actually bought the Bricastis because I was working on Far Cry Primal, and I needed something that sounded as real and just lush and thick as possible. And at the time, when I was doing some demos and trying to figure out what the sound of the score was going to be, I was using Valhalla Vintage Room. And I could get a pretty good, I was looking for room tones. I could get a pretty good room sound that had a decent amount of low end in it and things from the Valhalla. Now that's a $50 plugin. I'll put the link in the description. The Bricasti is, I don't even remember how much they cost. You can look them up. But I bought two. And as soon as I put the mix through, and there's nothing wrong with Valhalla, believe me, but it was a huge difference, especially in the bottom end. And there's even a preset called Bass XXL that all it does is just add a beefy low end to whatever you put through it. So I ended up getting 4 Bricastis because I used like a room close, a room far, a bass XL, and then I think it was called Musical Forest for the really long, I mean like 15-second long tail for Far Cry Primal. And those are the 4 presets that I had everything kind of defaulted to. So anything I was recording live was going through the first 2 presets, the room close and the room far. Anything I wanted low end on, like, you know, a stick thumping or something like that to kind of fill up the bottom, I would also send it to the Bass XXL, and then any vocals that Maluka did, or any flutes, or conch shell, or bull roar kind of sounds that I wanted to sound really big and epic, I sent to the 4th one. So those were basically my 4 reverb presets. Since that game wrapped up, I have them implemented for my own orchestra. So one more time, here's the completely 100% balanced. Normally I probably have it about here. So let's listen to that. All right, now we're going to turn that off and listen to the Lexicon, which is on the exact same settings, but this is a VST. Now that's a great sounding reverb, don't get me wrong. I use it for all of the other orchestra stuff, but you can hear how it's lacking some of the bottom end and that rich lower mid kind of sound. And even if I just play the reverb by itself. Now the Bricasti. You can hear how smooth the Bricasti is. Now you can tweak the Lexicon, of course. You can tweak it and have it EQ'd, and as a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure that on my Lexicon, this is the Lexicon that we were just listening to, so I have it set up the same way as the Bricasti, and I have this EQ after it, which is, you know, a 6 dB boost basically on all the low end to try to get it to come a little closer to the Bricasti. And you can still tell there's a huge difference. It's just the Bricasti is warmer and fatter. And the irony is the Lexicon, that's a 8-chip UAD card that's driving it, but it's just not, it's not the same. The hardware is always going to sound better. And it's not a matter of aesthetically better hardware and you're skimping if you use VSTs. It's like, in my experience, hardware makes it easier to sound better. You can sound more legit quicker with hardware because it's dedicated hardware to make that one sound, and it comes at an expense, both in terms of having to run things in real time, only being able to use one instance of it because it's hardware, and then the price of buying the box and the cables and everything else. So it's kind of a give and take depending on what you need. I probably wouldn't have gone out and bought 4 Bricasti reverbs just for orchestra. All my purchases are gig based. So if I have a Bricasti reverb, it's because I bought it for something super specific, like Far Cry Primal, for example. So the other great thing, and I just scooted this out of the way, but the other great thing about having parallel effects, having it on a send, is since your reverb is going to its own specific routing, in this case I have it going to horn long, because that's the only thing I'm using for reverb at the moment, You can EQ it. You can distort it. You can do all kinds of things to it. Put some extra chorus on it, put a flanger on it. You can put a tremolator from Sound Toys on it and have it kind of pulse. And anything you put here is only going to affect this reverb, and it's not going to affect the original dry sound. So if you're trying to do modern orchestra, kind of hybrid-y kinds of things, that's a great way to start. Use sends and put crazy effects on the sends, and then you've got your dry original signal, the send going to your affected signal, and you can blend those and even automate them a lot of times. So the orchestra's playing really full, and then you push up the send automation and you start getting that, you know, distorted tremolator kind of effect, and even pull the dry down. So all you hear is this kind of, is that like a synth with an LFO on it? Oh no, it's the orchestra, but it's just affected, and you have control over them that way. That's what a lot of this comes down to for me, is control. So I have one other example I thought I'd share that would help with effect sends and how I use it in my template. And I just did a quick drum thing. And I think that that's set up the way I normally have my drums. If we go back here and scroll over to drums, we can see that this is the Hans Zimmer low drums. Nothing here. And they're all going to HZ low, which is going to pop up right over here, and we scroll down and take a look at the drums. Let me turn that off. Here's a great example in action of why sends can really be process savers in terms of your CPU. This X AFX01, and I put an X before any of my effects sends. But look, ProR does not have an X in front of it, Mr. Graves. That's correct, it doesn't, and that's something that I need to fix because it should have an X in front of it. But we're not going to worry about that right now. So all three of these channels, the taikos, the low drums, and the high drums, which basically all that Hans Zimmer stuff is essentially big drums. I have the same AFX send on all of them. We can pull up the send, which is right down here. I think I have 3 of them in my template. AFX 1, 2, and 3. Let's scrunch this over and get it to fit. And scroll down. There we go. AFX 1, 2, and 3. So this is a Waves AFX aural exciter. Literally, it's on the default preset. I have the input set to 0 and the mix set to 10, meaning that it's just coming in however I send it, and it's 100% wet. The output, I think it was so hot I had to pull it down, so the output's down 2.5, and I have the noise turned off. I have the mains turned off. No noise, basically. First mix version, I didn't do a whole lot to it. And if I turn this off, turning the send off, which channel are we coming in on? There. Now you just heard it. I'm gonna turn it off. Back on. I know you can hear that crispy top end that it's adding, and it's not something you can do with EQ. The EQ, even at a super sharp slope going to 15K or using some of those air EQs that do 32K or something like that, it's not the same. The aural exciter is harmonically doing something. I won't get into all the details, but it really is kind of fascinating. And I love the way it makes drum sound. And you notice that I've got it -14.5. I mean, the signal coming out of the AFX is -14 decibels down. If I turned it all... all right, let me see. I'll move it as we play, and you can hear the difference. One more time without. Oh, geez, where'd the top end go? It's amazing what this does. And I'll use this on all kinds of different drums. Anything, oh, here we go. What do we got? Oh, the taiko. So this is Arc 3 from Orchestral Tools. I defaulted to putting the same Aphex send on the taikos and low drums that they have there. Now, a lot of times if you have like tone hammer or 8DO, heaviosity, those already have some pretty good top end on them. And the 8DO tone hammer stuff, I actually have to pull back. It's super, super bright, but it's great for cutting through the mix. The heaviosity stuff is a lot more smooth in a way. It's those big drums that were recorded so well in Air Studios, and you're getting all that meaty bottom end, and just adding a little bit of that top end helps define their place in the mix for me, which is why I've got them defaulted with the Aphex send. And you may have noticed there are 3 Aphex sends actually, and I'm only using one of them because I've got the other 2 set to the exact same thing, and I can do a send to them as well if I want to. All of these are probably all going to the same drum 01, drum 01, drum 01, drum 01. Now there's a drum 02. So this would just be set up however I want it. A lot of times, all 3 of these buses are going out to low drum 01, like this. Drum, low 01. If I wanted to have a drum low 02 bus, then I could use my second Aphex and have it set up that way. Looks like I needed a little more on the arc stuff to give it a little more brightness to help it cut through. But that is just like such a great tool for adding just the tiniest bit of something. And I think I saw an Andrew Shep's video, and he was doing, it wasn't Bob Marley, it was Bob Marley's son, but he was doing mixing the song that was Bob Marley's son's song, and it was very reggae and very cool, and he used it as a send on the background vocals, and it just completely brought them forward and a little bit of sparkle in the mix to sit really well with the lead vocal. And I thought, well, shoot, I'm a drummer, I'm going to use it for drums because I don't do a lot of background vocal stuff around here. So that's the Aphex. And the second thing that I want to talk about is if I wanted to add a little more reverb to these drums. They're pretty big. But let's say I wanted to add more, because who doesn't ever want to add more reverb? So if I go back to my drum bus, we're already there, and scroll back over here. Beautiful icons, by the way, from Pound Sound. The link is always in the description, worth every penny. I've got, just as a test, I did this ProR, which is such a wonderful sounding reverb. Now, if I go to it 0, you can hear it's a little big. So let's just pull it back to like 10 and then take a look at the effect itself and see how it's working. This reverb, I gotta say, I love reverbs, and the UAD stuff, their compressors, it's really hard to beat UAD because they have the standalone hardware processing everything. But if I didn't have hardware and I had to choose software-based VST effects, FabFilter and Soundtoys would be the 2 things I would go to immediately. And I will have independent episodes on both of those because I love them both so much. And FabFilter really outdid themselves with the ProR. It's, I think, probably the most versatile and smoothest sounding VST-based reverb that I've ever heard. And I love Valhalla. I love the 2C audio stuff. There's so many different reverbs that I love using. What else is down here? Lots of Aphex, Bricasti. This is all UAD, the RMX and the EMT plates. ProR, I don't know what kind of a processor hit it takes because that's just not something I normally keep track of, but boy, what an amazing sounding verb. Not to mention their GUIs are always just so sexy. It's the rare example, and the Lexicon and Ocean Way reverbs from UAD do this as well. The reverb is like sticking to the sound. It sounds like it's part of the drums. It sounds like the drums were recorded with that reverb on it. And a lot of times I've noticed when I try adding other types of reverbs, and Valhalla like does it 50% of the way, but for a $50 plugin, who's going to complain about that? With other reverbs, it sounds like the reverb is separate, like it's been pasted on after the fact. And with the Bricastis especially, that's the first time I heard it. And then the UAD reverbs were the second ones that I'd heard. And then now ProR, it's like Bricasti is hardware unit standalone. That's the pinnacle, right? It's the best. The UAD comes very, very close because it's card-based. And now FabFilter somehow have done it without any additional hardware, and it's almost just as good. And the versatility is really nice. I love how you've got a brightness and a character between clean or chorused, and the distance. It's just really, really great. So if you listen to it, I'm sold. That sounds wonderful. Now if we turn it off, now hopefully your ears are dialing into that fundamental pitch from the drums that the reverb, this reverb, is accentuating. And I think this was just a preset that I picked. I think I went to large and said, hey, that sounds like something I would want to try for this video. Come on, that's just a really, really nice reverb. And they have all kinds of effects and things too. Tempo synced. You can just mess around and do crazy stuff. So I would reverse engineer my reverb needs that way. If you're really looking for something outside of your DAW-based reverbs, Valhalla, it's going to be hard to beat, especially for the money. It's $50. I would do that immediately. And then if you want to take a step up from there, ProR is really, really, really amazing. And then a step up from there would be the UAD stuff. So I hope this has helped you get your head around reverb and effect sends in general and how I use them in my template. As you can see, I've got lots of lexicons. I'm not even sure how many are running at this point in time. Usually it's 65 or 70 or something like that, and the UAD card is at maybe 20 or 30%. Well, the set of UAD cards. I've got 3 of the octo cards put together. Because the whole point is to be able to run this stuff and not have the processor in the computer have to sweat too much, because the cards are the ones that are doing all the work. So I hope this makes sense. I hope it helps. And as always, thanks for watching. Now it's turkey time. Wait! One more thing I forgot to mention. Since we are talking about reverbs and effects, and YouTube is not exactly the best audio quality, I'm going to go ahead and freeze everything that we've gone through in this video as audio, and you can download it as part of the template series that I've got on the Patreon page. That'll include like the dry horns, the horns with the Bricasti, the horns with 100% Bricasti, all those variations, and hopefully I'll just label the wave files so it's straightforward enough to make them out in a list. And you can listen at full quality, 24-bit, 48K, same thing with the drums. With that being said, now it is